The wind pressed its cold breath across the town, carrying with it the sharp bite of snow that settled on rooftops and blanketed the dirt street in white. Doors shut fast against the storm, yet curtains still shifted, thin hands clutching at their edges as eyes peered out to watch her pass. She walked barefoot, each step sinking into the powder, each step a mark of disgrace. Her skin was raw from the cold, her feet crimson against the pale crust, and still she did not lift her chin. They had told her this was her penance. She must walk the length of the street, bare and silent, so that every soul could see her humbled. It was not the law that bound her, but the cruelty of neighbors, their whispers sharper than any sheriff's decree. She had crossed some invisible line, whether through defiance or words spoken too boldly or mistake not easily forgiven. The details mattered less than the spectacle of her shame. The town carried its judgment in silence, broken only by the crunch of her steps. Men stood on porches with arms folded. Women glanced from behind lace, their mouths thin and tight. Children leaned forward in doorways until their mothers pulled them back. No one spoke, yet every gaze weighed heavy on her shoulders. It was as if the snow itself had been called to witness, each flake a reminder that she was set apart, marked for humiliation. She pulled her arms tight around her body, her dress thin, its hem stiff with frost. Her lashes glittered with ice, and her breath rose in pale plumes. She thought of warmth, of firelight and wool, of hands that once offered kindness. The memory struck like a blow. She pressed it down, kept walking. There was no room for softness here. A dog barked at the end of the street. A voice muttered low behind a window. The sound of boots shuffled on a stoop, restless, impatient for the sight to end. She was not the first to be paraded in shame, and she would not be the last. This was how the town kept its order, by breaking those who stepped outside its frame. The snow deepened as she passed the last lamppost. Beyond, the road stretched toward the open land, where fences bent low under drifts and pines rose dark against the horizon. The town behind her blurred in the storm. Still, she kept on, her feet numb, her breath ragged. The punishment was not only to walk, but to keep walking, until body and spirit both surrendered. At the edge of the timberline, her strength faltered. The cold had moved past pain into a strange, heavy quiet, as though her blood had thickened into ice. She stumbled, caught herself, and stumbled again. Her hands brushed the snow as she fell to her knees. The silence of the wilderness pressed around her, deeper and heavier than the hush of the watching town. Here there were no eyes, no whispers, only the vast, indifferent storm. She looked once over her shoulder. The town was hidden now, swallowed by distance and snowfall. For a moment she felt relief, even in the ache of her limbs. To be unseen was its own kind of mercy. She let her eyes close, surrendering to the snow's soft pull. But before the dark could take her, a shadow shifted at the edge of her sight. She opened her eyes to find a figure there, half-shaped by the storm, broad and still, as if carved from the pines themselves. A man, tall and rough with the wild about him. His coat was heavy, his beard dusted with frost, his eyes unreadable in the dim light. He stood where the trees began, watching without moving, as though the land itself had called him forth. Her breath caught, shallow and weak. Fear flickered. Was he another judge, another witness to her disgrace? Yet something in his stillness held no cruelty. He did not speak. He did not turn away. He only stood, as though weighing whether to step forward. The wind shifted, driving snow between them. She shivered, her body trembling, her hands sinking into the drift. Her strength was gone. She lowered her head, no longer able to hold herself upright. The sound of boots moved closer, muffled in the snow. A hand touched her shoulder, warm, steady, rough with labor yet gentle in its hold. She flinched, but the hand did not tighten. It lingered with quiet patience, a presence that neither forced nor abandoned. Slowly, she lifted her eyes to him. His face was weathered, the lines of years and storms etched deep. His gaze was steady, neither hard nor soft, only present. He carried the silence of the mountains in him, a silence that did not demand explanation. He shrugged the heavy blanket from his shoulders and wrapped it around her with a care that surprised her. The wool was thick, smelling of pine smoke in the wild, and its weight closed around her like a shield against the storm. For the first time since the punishment began, warmth touched her skin. It seeped slow into her bones, fragile yet undeniable. She clutched the blanket, too weary to speak, too raw to question. He lifted her with ease, as though she were no heavier than a child, and carried her toward the shelter of the trees. Behind them, the town was hidden. Before them, the wilderness stretched, vast and merciless. Yet in the circle of his arms, with the blanket drawn close, she felt something shift, a thread of grace woven through the cold. The punishment had stripped her bare, but in this stranger's silence she sensed no judgment, only the promise of shelter. The snow continued to fall, covering the path behind them, erasing the trail of her shame step by step, until nothing remained but the storm and the faint warmth of the man's presence carrying her forward. When she woke, it was to the crackle of fire and the sharp scent of pine smoke. The storm still howled beyond the walls, but here the world was hushed, broken only by the shifting pop of burning logs. She lay beneath a heavy quilt, her body wrapped in warmth so foreign it startled her. For a moment she thought herself dreaming. Then the ache in her feet returned, faint but real, a reminder of the road she had walked. She stirred, the cloth rustling against her skin, and the cabin's dim light revealed its keeper. He sat near the hearth, mending a harness strap with coarse thread, his shoulders bent to the task, the fire throwing long shadows over his frame. He did not look up when she moved. His silence filled the room, steady as the rhythm of his hands. She watched him through half-lidded eyes, unsure if she should speak. But the words tangled in her throat, unfit for this place. The shame of her punishment clung still, heavier even than the quilt. The cabin was plain, built of rough-hewn logs and patched where the weather had eaten deep. A single shelf carried jars of dried beans. A rifle rested in the corner, and a wolf pelt lay across the floor before the fire. Nothing here was for show. Each piece carried its weight. It was a room built for survival, not comfort, yet in its simplicity she felt a strange safety. The storm outside pressed hard against the walls, but within there was a shelter strong enough to keep her. At length he rose, setting aside the strap. He ladled stew from a pot over fire, its steam curling into the room, rich with the scent of venison and onion. He carried the bowl to her, his boots soft on the wood. When he held it out, she met his eyes for the first time. They were dark, unyielding, yet not cruel. He did not offer words, only the food, as though speech was unnecessary. Her hands trembled as she took it. The heat of the bowl seeped into her palms, and she felt tears sting her eyes at the simple mercy of it. She ate slow, every bite an anchor pulling her back from the edge of that snow-filled void. When she finished, she whispered her thanks, though her voice cracked thin in the stillness. He gave a small nod, no more. Then he returned to the hearth, where the silence settled around them again. It was not a silence born of disdain, but of habit, perhaps even respect. She found herself listening to it, measuring her own breath against the steady rhythm of his. The hours passed with the storm. He moved through his tasks as though her presence changed nothing, splitting kindling, patching a tear in his coat, stirring the stew again. She watched from beneath the quilt, her shame softened by the ordinary nature of his care. He did not ask who she was, nor why she had been cast out. The absence of questions startled her. In town, every look demanded an answer. Here, there was only space, quiet and unbroken, as though her past had no place within these walls. That night, when the wind screamed through the pines, she woke shivering despite the fire. She shifted beneath the quilt, teeth clattering, and saw him rise from his cot without hesitation. He added another log, crouched low to coax the flames higher, and only when the blaze warmed the cabin again did he return to rest. He never spoke, never asked if she was well, yet in the gesture there was care, plain and unadorned, the kind that expected nothing in return. Morning came dim, the sky hidden by snow. She found her shoes by the hearth, mended with new leather patches, their seams stitched with the same coarse thread he had used on the harness. She touched them with cautious fingers, feeling the work in every line. Her throat tightened. He had seen her ruin, yet instead of casting it aside, he had made it whole again. The days slid together, measured by the storm's relentlessness. She began to move about the cabin, first timid, then with growing steadiness. She swept the floor with a pine branch, hung his coat to dry, tried her hand at shaping bread from flour she found on the shelf. The loaf came out misshapen, burned at the edges, but when she placed it on the table, he ate it without comment, as though its flaws mattered little. She felt her cheeks warm in the firelight, not with shame but with something quieter, an unfamiliar pride that she had given back, however small. At times she caught him watching her, not with the sharp eyes of judgment, but with the steady regard of one measuring weather. She wondered what he thought, what he saw in her silence. Perhaps he saw only a burden, a storm-bound guest who would leave when the roads cleared. Yet there were moments, brief and fragile, when his hand lingered on a tool she had touched or his gaze followed her to the window. They never spoke of it, but something unspoken drew them closer, as though the silence itself was weaving a thread between them. Outside, the snow deepened. Wolves howled across the ridge, their voices long and thin. She pressed a blanket tighter around her shoulders when she heard them, fear tugging at her chest. But he stood by the door, rifle in hand, listening not with alarm but with patience. His stillness steadied her. She realized then that fear had less power in his presence. One evening, when the storm broke just enough to show the moon, she stepped outside. The snow stretched endless, shining under silver light. The cold bit her skin, but wrapped in his blanket, she stood firm. The trees whispered in the wind, and the silence was vast, not empty but full of something she could not name. She turned back and saw him in the doorway, watching his form dark against the cabin's glow. For a heartbeat, their eyes held across the distance. No words passed, yet she felt the moment settle deep inside her, a promise unnamed but undeniable. She went back inside, her steps light despite the weight of snow clinging to the blanket. She sat by the fire, and he closed the door behind her. The storm would come again, she knew. The world beyond would not forget her shame. But here in the shelter of silence, she found something the town could never grant, room to breathe, to endure, and perhaps to begin again. When the storm at last loosened its hold, the world did not return to peace. The snow lay deep across the land, muffling the sound of hooves, softening fences, bending trees low. Yet in town, voices found their way back to sharpness, carried over by gossip that cut through walls more fiercely than any wind. Word spread quickly. She was alive, not buried by the storm as some had whispered, but sheltered in the cabin of the mountain man. The tale bent itself with every telling. Some claimed she had run to him, that her disgrace had drawn her to the wilderness by choice. Others muttered that he had taken her in with reasons unfit to be spoken aloud. None dared climb the cabin themselves, yet tongues wagged freely by firelight, and each murmur fastened tighter to her name. Reputation in a small town was a fragile thing. Once broken, it seldom found repair. She felt in the air when she ventured back near the settlement, the snow hard beneath her patched shoes. Men glanced at her too long, their stares rough with suspicion. Women drew their children close, their whispers like nettles against her skin. Even those who had once shared bread with her now turned their backs as though she carried contagion. The punishment she had endured on the street had not ended. It had merely taken new shape. Yet back in the cabin, life moved by quieter rules. The mountain man kept to his rhythm, chopping wood, setting snares, mending the roof where ice had pressed heavy. She joined in where she could, learning his silent ways. He never asked her to prove her worth, but she felt the need all the same. She fetched water from the stream, her breath freezing in clouds as she hauled the bucket. She swept snow from the doorway before it could crust into ice. She stitched torn cloth with steady hands, though her fingers ached from the cold. Each task, small as it seemed, gave her a thread of belonging she had thought forever lost. Still, doubt lingered between them, quiet but constant. At night, when the fire dimmed low, she wondered what he thought of her. Did he believe the stories whispered in town? Did he see her as broken, or merely passing through until spring opened the roads? He never gave her an answer. His silence was both mercy and burden, for in it she found no condemnation, yet neither did she find certainty. One evening, as twilight pressed soft against the windows, he placed a pair of snowshoes at her feet. They were crafted from bent wood and rawhide, worn but strong. He gestured toward the door, a rare invitation. She followed him outside, the snow deep and blue beneath the fading sky. He showed her how to strap them tight, how to move across the drifts without sinking. At first she stumbled, awkward as a child. He watched without comment, his steady gaze neither mocking nor impatient. When at last she found her balance, he gave the faintest nod, approval carried in the smallest of gestures. That night she lay awake beneath the quilt, thinking of the nod, the quiet pride that had warmed her more than the fire. It was not affection, not the language of townsfolk who courted with words and rings, but it was something truer, born of shared endurance. The gossip grew harsher as winter deepened. She heard it one day when she slipped into town for flour. The shopkeeper's wife whispered that a woman who lived under a man's roof, unwed, could never claim decency again. Another muttered that the mountain man himself was dangerous, that he had lived too long among wolves and storms to know right from wrong. Their words burned, yet she held her head high, clutching the sack of flour close to her chest. Shame no longer bent her as it once had. The weight of their judgment was heavy, but she was learning to stand beneath it. Back at the cabin, she set the flour on the table, her hands shaking not from cold, but from the effort of holding her composure. He looked at her once, seeing more than she said, and without speaking added another log to the fire. It was a simple act, yet she understood it as his way of standing with her, of answering the town's whispers with warmth instead of words. In that silence, trust began to root itself deeper. Not trust in the town, not in the fragile fairness of neighbors, but in something steadier. The quiet companionship of a man who asked nothing, who judged nothing, who offered only his presence. She realized she was no longer waiting for him to demand her story. The fact that he did not was its own kind of gift. One afternoon, as the sun cut sharp through the trees and the snow shone like silver, she heard wolves howling across the ridge. The sound once filled her with dread, but now it stirred something else, a strange kinship. The wolves carried their survival in their voices, and so did she. She looked toward him then, standing with axe in hand, his form outlined against the sky. He glanced back, and for a breath their eyes held. No words passed, yet in that silence she felt her place beside him, fragile but real. The town would not relent. Gossip would follow her steps for as long as she walked its streets. But in the cabin, in the wilderness that asked no questions, she was learning to breathe again. The thread of trust between them was thin, but it was there, binding them more surely than any vow spoken in haste. She felt it each time he mended what was broken, each time she set bread on the table, each time silence carried more weight than words. And though the storm clouds gathered once more beyond the ridge, she did not fear their coming. For in the hush of that cabin, she had found a shelter stronger than snow, stronger even than the weight of gossip. The storm broke with sudden clarity. The skies scoured clean of clouds. The land lay bare under a merciless moon. Snow glittered in ridges and hollows, sharp as broken glass, and the silence was so complete it carried its own weight. She stood in it, wrapped in his blanket, the wool rough against her cheek, her breath lifting in pale ribbons. The cold stung, but it no longer felt like punishment. It was proof she had endured. She had gone outside to test herself, bare feet pressing into the crusted snow. The sting cut deep, yet she did not flinch. Each step was a memory of that first walk through town, when every eye burned her raw. Now there were no witnesses but the trees, the stars, and the man who watched from the cabin doorway. His face was shadowed, unreadable, but his presence steadied her. He had given her space to break, to mend, to stand again. But the world beyond the ridge had not forgotten. Lantern light flickered down the trail, a cluster of shapes moving with purpose. The sound of boots broke the hush. Voices carried sharp and brittle in the night air. The townsfolk had come. She saw them before he did. Her breath caught, not from cold but from the weight of recognition. They moved as a unit, stiff-backed and sure of their right. Their coats swung heavy, their words low but edged with disdain. When they reached the clearing, the leader, one of the storekeepers, lifted his lantern high, its glow spilling across her bare feet. The blanket clutched to her shoulders, the mountain man's shadow stretching long behind her. "So it's true," the man said. His voice was hard. carrying not anger alone but the righteousness of judgment. You've chosen your place, and it's not among decent folk. The others shifted, nodding, whispering, feeding on each other's scorn. They had come not only to see but to make certain, to cast their verdict with no chance of appeal. Shame flared hot in her chest, but she did not lower her gaze. She had bent once, and it had nearly broken her. She would not bow again. The mountain man stepped forward then, slow and deliberate. His boots sank deep, his shoulders filling the space between her and the crowd. He did not speak, not at first. His silence was heavier than their words, a stillness that made some glance away though none retreated. He looked at them one by one, his face carved in stone. When at last he moved, it was not with a weapon, but with a gesture so simple it cut sharper than steel. He drew the blanket from his shoulders, lifted it high enough for all to see, and wrapped it around her. The wool fell heavy, enclosing her in warmth, shielding her from their gaze. The act carried no apology, no hesitation. It was a claim, plain and unashamed. The crowd faltered. Whispers broke apart into fragments, sharp edges dulled by uncertainty. Some muttered of impropriety, of sin carried bold into the open. Others looked away, the righteousness in her eyes dimmed by the quiet defiance before them. He had given no speech, no plea, yet in that single act he had spoken louder than any argument. Her heart pounded. Beneath the blanket, her hands gripped the fabric tight, her breath unsteady. She felt the weight of their stares pressing, yet the wool steadied her, its warmth drawn from his body, his silence, his unflinching choice to stand beside her. The snow bit at her feet, but she no longer felt its sting. What had once been punishment was now ground she claimed with dignity. The leader spat into the snow, his voice losing its edge. "You've made your bed. Don't expect welcome when you come back down." He turned, lantern swinging, boots crunching loud in the frozen stillness. One by one, the others followed, some muttering, some silent, their bravado unraveling as they melted back into the dark. The clearing grew quiet again, the echo of their passing swallowed by the trees. She stood unmoving, the blanket heavy against her shoulders, her breath trembling as though her body had not yet caught up with what had passed. He did not touch her, did not press her forward. He simply remained, a steady shadow at her side. At last she lifted her eyes to him. His face was unreadable, the fire of the lanterns gone from his gaze, but she felt the truth of him in the way he stayed, unshaken. Her voice, when it came, was no more than a whisper. "They will never forget." He gave the smallest shake of his head, not in denial but in dismissal, as though their judgment held no weight here. His silence was not empty. It was full of meaning, full of the choice he had already made. The night pressed close again, cold and vast, yet she felt no fear. She pulled the blanket tighter, her fingers digging into the wool, and stood taller. What the town had sought to strip from her, he had given back, not in words, not in promises, but in the steady strength of a man who chose kindness over condemnation. She turned her face toward the moon, the snow gleaming like a field of silver. The cold licked her skin, yet within the blanket she carried warmth enough to meet it. She felt the shift inside her, quiet but profound. She was no longer the punished, no longer the outcast bent beneath whispers. She was something else now, resilient, unbroken, and claimed not by shame but by her own endurance. The mountain man stepped back toward the cabin, his figure dark against the glow of the fire within. She followed, her step steady, the blanket trailing behind her like a banner across the snow. Before she crossed the threshold, she turned once more to the silent clearing. The trail of the townsfolk was already fading, swallowed by moonlight and frost. She thought then of all who carried their own punishments, unseen but no less heavy, and her chest ached with sudden understanding. "Remember this," she whispered, though no one remained to hear. "The world may strip you bare, but one act of mercy can return to you the fire of your worth. Hold fast when it comes." The door closed behind her. The storm would rise again someday, and the town's voices would never quiet fully. But tonight, within the blanket shelter, she carried something stronger than scorn, and with it she stepped into the glow of the fire, unafraid of what waited beyond.